Just in time for the spooky season, this video is brought to you by They Speak from the Abyss, an indie psychological horror dungeon crawling RPG. I first got involved as a publisher in this project based on the strength of Nikki's art alone. But I think the gameplay, the secrets, the depth, the characters, the world, the story, it's really gonna rope people in. I think this is something very special. And we're gearing up to launch a Kickstarter campaign soon to take it the rest of the way. If you're interested in that, be sure to go give it a follow so that you don't miss the launch of that campaign, or if you're interested in more of a long-term sense, it does have a Steam page now and you can go and give it a wishlist. Both help us immensely. Thanks for hearing me out, and let's get to the video. How's it going, everyone? My name's Graham and welcome to Two Left Thumbs. After covering Deltarune Chapter 2 in as much detail as I could possibly manage, I think the next most logical video topic to cover would be predictions of what comes next for this series. I have plenty of other videos cooking. I plan to carry on doing those Gags videos for Undertale in the near future as well, but after all that time spent dissecting Chapter 2, what I'm left wondering the most is what's coming in Chapter 3. There are presumably very little specifics we'll be able to predict, as Toby can near endlessly stretch and twist any of these concepts. And for a series built around giving us more than what we expect, also subverting those most basic expectations, the most accurate prediction I can make is that the final game will not really be predictable. It's a cop-out, I know, I'm going with it. The connections to Undertale are numerous yet still totally unclear. The Dark Worlds all provide so much opportunity to imagine settings, enemies, bosses, themes, and more. The concepts of character, player, and control all can be manipulated, warped, and used against us. The introduction of the weird route means either more routes are coming or that one will become deeper. Considering how much information we now have, combined with Toby's wonderful ability to surprise us, created this irresistible opportunity to guess and predict what comes next. I may reach beyond Chapter 3 a little bit, but I'm planning to do a follow-up video to this where I predict larger elements of the finished Deltarune. The most obvious place to start building these Chapter 3 predictions is, where will it be set and what will its resulting story and themes be? Simply through its storytelling, I have to assume the continued loop of visiting a new dark world, going on a grand adventure, then coming back to the hometown and unpacking the adventure a bit at home. Here's a brief overview of the themes we've been given so far. This is a game all about freedom and control. Chapter 1 insisted that it was linear and choices don't matter. Chapter 2 showed that many choices and actions did matter. Random gags of remembered details all carrying forward. The recruitment of enemies, and now influencing Noelle. We now have Chapter 3 being initiated by Chris outside of our control. And this new chapter now obviously needs to pay off the separate routes seen in Chapter 2. The idea that choices don't matter has been challenged in Chapter 2 and is about to be blown wide open with Chapter 3. This video has actually been in the works for a while. I think it would have hit a lot harder if I would have managed to get it out before the Spampton sweepstakes, which did end up teasing and confirming a few things. Like, based on the green room and the weather people we've been shown, it 100% is going to be TV themed. But the remainder of the arguments and evidence I use for the rest of this video all came before the sweepstakes. This has been pointed to for quite some time now. So, attempting to pencil in some specifics for the upcoming chapter. It will almost certainly be a TV-themed world. It may end up tying in the kitchen, or possibly even elements of Chris and Asriel's rooms. The more interesting thing will be to see whether Toriel gets pulled in. There's a very strong chance she will be, almost 100% I would say, and if so, will she have her Undertale design and fire powers? Those are some of my biggest questions right now. That's gonna really inform the whole concept of whether or not this is a sequel, a prequel, an alternate universe, a simulation. There are a million different ways to look at that, and it's one of the biggest questions looming over this pair of games. Slightly less likely than Toriel, something like 99.9%, and potentially even more interesting is that Undyne is likely to be pulled in as well, having just been called by Toriel at the end of Chapter 2. There's almost no reason Toby would have set that up unless these two characters were going to be a part of this new dark world. Now, Chris left the door open, which means the dark world could potentially pull in things from the town. In our two previous examples, they've existed in rooms within buildings that are then cut off via doorways. I don't think it'll go that far. That's kind of too big of a piece to bite off all at once. Rather, I think it just goes to show that the door is unlocked. Undyne will see a big glowing light, be confused, and let herself in, trying to check up on the Dreamer family, only to be sucked into the fountain. Undyne's presence is going to be a critically important plot point. Chris has been trying to tell her about the dark world for 2 chapters now, only to be blown off and have it turned into these gags. Chris, without our control, has contrived a situation that will lure Undyne to this world and force her to see it firsthand. This independent body that we have no control over does not appear to be nefarious. It's very likely that we, the player, are essentially the villain of this story, enacting our control over this character and taking away Chris's free will. Seizing a brief moment of independence, Chris is trying to bring in additional help. Tying back to the game's themes and likely TV setting, what better way to explore freedom and control than through actors reading scripts, traveling through hollow, barren sets, and repeatedly encountering fake and manufactured drama? Are we in control, or is this world designed to control us? Is any of what we're seeing real? How much of it is preordained? What level of autonomy does anyone really have? This is going to be like Matrix-level mind-bending if it plays out how I expect, just with far less exposition dumping. Everything will feel like a lie, and that fleeting feeling of freedom in Chapter 2 will be challenged. We've gone from old board games and toys, to outdated computer tech, and now presumably this TV world. But that's more the framing of the dark world. What will the actual settings be? Where will we visit within? These chapters are typically split into different areas. You have something like the cyber fields and then the cyber city. I imagine we'll travel through about 3 TV areas within this world. Some of the potential settings that come to mind are a game show, a western, dramas, procedural cop and crime shows, sitcoms, anime, fantasy, cooking and food shows, and anything in between. Each one has so much potential. Give it a minute and I'll explore some of those in greater detail. I expect the environments to look like fake Hollywood stages and sets, with many of the enemies and objects being themed around props, costumes, actors, fake backdrops, and cardboard cutouts, tying in some of these potential TV themes. I'd love to see an opening scene that riffs on the typical sitcom format. That'd be a hilarious way to introduce this chapter. Then transition to something like a murder mystery or detective show. Undyne coming to investigate the slashed tire could become something much larger. I don't know if a sort of cop or crime drama will be an overarching thing across the entire chapter, or if it would exist as its own isolated section of the game. I think what would be most interesting is if Undyne was treating this mystery as something that spans the entire chapter, popping in and out of the story, collecting clues and trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together, while we move through these different environments or TV sets that make up the different areas and sections of Chapter 3. So as we're moving through the different TV genres, everything starts out in a location and set in which Undyne's presence makes sense, but then we start getting these weird mashups of different TV formats. Maybe we move through a cooking section or a game show, and Undyne is there rooting through everything, thinking it's a new clue or piece of evidence. That could be really funny. My confidence in this plot point comes from the fact that Undyne has mentioned wishing she had bank robberies to stop. It would make that setting a wish fulfillment for her, playing out a more exciting scenario than what she encounters in her own small town. An alternative take on this could be a Wild West world where she is instead a sheriff. I've seen that pitched multiple times. Maybe that would be a little bit more interesting. People have probably seen this fan-edited video that puts it in a Wild West setting. That's a cool idea. I could see it going either way. I kind of just personally prefer the idea of having Undyne as this hard-boiled noir type detective, or like a campy one-line delivering CSI officer. But yeah, sheriff would be a fun play on that as well. I'm also expecting Undyne is going to be the lone Lightner seen outside the group, experiencing this world in her own way, the way Susie did in Chapter 1 and Birdley did in Chapter 2. We have a bit of a rapport built with Toriel and Susie, and yeah, obviously she gets along with Chris. So Chris, Susie, and Toriel are probably going to be the main three we travel around with. Maybe Toriel will come and go while Susie and Ralsei get up to something on their own, same as happened with Noelle. Saving this for the larger video, but Ralsei is just like definitely up to something, and he can't really do any of that if he spends the entire chapter with us. So yeah, he's gonna come and go. Let me kind of steer some of this back on track. We've worked our way through various different areas in this chapter and now need to wrap it up with a big conclusion. A funny way to do that and keep things on theme would be a big blockbuster showdown, but a way to make it even funnier would be a made-for-TV, low-budget blockbuster showdown. At the end of Chapter 2, Susie was flicking through a bunch of different channels that could inform the locations of Chapter 3. We know Susie was watching some sort of Godzilla-like kaiju show, so that could very easily be tied in and would be great for an end boss. We also have a cooking show tease, combined with the fact that the kitchen is right there. This will very likely be pulled in, and is almost certainly going to be one of the sections we visit. That's my general prediction. Sitcom opening, a cop show style mystery trying to solve something that loosely connects to a slash tire, with Undyne being on the case, Chris being the primary suspect. At some point moving into more of a cooking show that we know both Susie and Toriel are probably going to be excited about, and will very much mirror the game show and cooking show segments of Undertale with Mettaton, wrapping things up with a big blockbuster finale against a giant kaiju. Potentially literally against Susie Zilla, but that might be a beat too far. Both chapters have had somewhat grand, isolated final settings. Chapter 1 ended in a castle, Chapter 2 ending in a mansion. I'm guessing they're not going to want to literally retread that ground doing either a castle or a mansion, but I do predict that we will once again end in one larger area. Maybe this one ends in a TV studio rather than a household of some sort, a place of central authority over this TV world. While Susie Zilla as a final boss could be fun, we have a little bit more to go off of that might better inform where this is headed. Looking at the final bosses of each chapter, the first had the Spade King and the second had the Queen. So we now need an overarching boss for this chapter, one who potentially pops in and out of the story, follows along, provides commentary, and has their own agenda. So while a giant kaiju might factor in on some level, it's probably going to be like the pet of the final boss or something, rather than the actual boss themselves. Predicting this boss doesn't have to be a total shot in the dark. Again, we're attempting to fill in the next connection in a pattern that doesn't have many previous examples, but if this is anything to go off of, then there is actually this trail of breadcrumbs that might be telling us who the boss of the next chapter is. In Chapter 1, our secret boss, Jevil, was the one who first introduced the Queen, showing the capacity to be aware of things outside of his own dark world, warning that the Queen was fast approaching, even tying in the roaring that we had not yet learned about. If it becomes a rule that these secret bosses are meant to be aware of things outside of their own world, and thus introduce hints at the new central antagonist of a future chapter, then we should now look at Spamton from Chapter 2. I realize that like 1.5 examples doesn't really equate to a pattern, but it's all we have to go off of, and oh man, it's going to be satisfying if this ends up being true. I've seen others mention it, I'm in the same boat as them, and I think it's a fun swing for the fences prediction. So following this loose assumption, Spamton frequently mentions an otherwise unseen character, Mike, one who seemingly had the control and influence to give him his tenuous success before he lost everything. This could tie in to the old Big Shot soda commercial that users have found online. This featured a Mike Ditka and aired back in 1997. I really hoped this was some long-planned alternate reality game that Toby was planting the seeds for. No, this is a real soda and a real commercial from New Orleans, but there are just so many connections. Mike, Big Shot. 1997 is a year that Spamton frequently mentions. I can't help but think there's something with this commercial, but maybe it was an inspiration and isn't actually going to be tied in or referenced any more directly. And it's still a possibility that it's just a coincidence. Spamton refers to Mike as a criminal, while his eyes are bleary with TV static. That's maybe the number one thing that makes me think it's hinting towards this TV world. I think what'll be the best fit for Mike as a character, or whoever the overarching villain ends up being, will be something along the lines of a news anchor, broadcaster, or an infomercial host like Billy Mays. The latter would fit better with that Big Shot Soda video, but any of them would make for a good recurring character, popping into the game like a commercial interrupting the story, or some sort of urgent news broadcast that cuts off whatever we were doing to ramble about their villainous ploys. And you know, if this is Mike, it'll probably be revealed in some way this is short for microphone, or his name will be Mike Row Phone, or something like that. In general, having a character who interrupts to give you a sales pitch will be a good reason to have him pop in semi-frequently and be a recurring presence just like Queen. If he's used to being a leading man or the center of attention in front of the camera, he'll also be used to controlling his audience, both by transmitting his thoughts and influence, but also through concepts like prompting a studio audience to laugh and applaud whenever he sees fit. Going all the way back to Undertale, Toby has had characters like Flowey mention people who choose to be the audience, rather than playing out a genocide route themselves. Having a meta look at an in-game audience and the real-world audience experiencing the game together is likely to be heavily played up. That's the sort of exact layered meta that Toby loves playing around with. I imagine Mike will flex his ability to control others and will attempt to control Chris and the rest of our party, opening up some unique interactions that bring forth and potentially fully reveal us, the player, and our control in a way that others like Susie and Toriel will observe for the very first time. We're around the midpoint of the game. That has to get revealed at some point. This feels like a good place for it. Currently, our only real drive and conflict is closing up these fountains as they open. Sooner or later, they'll have to realize that doesn't count for much if fountains are being opened by Chris without them having any real say in it. So I think this will come forward in this chapter. After talking a lot about Mike, our potential main antagonist, how about our third secret boss? Characters that are aware of things beyond the usual confines of the game. We know for a fact, through our conversations with Sham about the Shadow Crystals, that there will be more of these secret fights, most likely one per chapter. I've seen this great suggestion that these secret bosses always exist slightly outside of the world because they are brought to life through discarded and unwanted things. They were cast aside in the real world, resulting in them being cast aside in the dark world. Jevil was a playing card, most likely the Joker. He knew that he existed within a game. Spamton was a piece of junk mail or spam software who knows that he is controlled and puppeteered by outside forces. They have this unique perspective to know there's something more going on. These two characters so far are some of the biggest factors driving the themes of freedom and control, both having their own monologues about those concepts. Yes, the themes are explored beyond those battles, but it is through these that it's addressed more head-on. Undertale made us deal with saving and loading, playing through a game as many times as we wanted, treating these digital characters as inconsequential, and influencing their lives however we saw fit. But that was addressed through Frisk. This is taking that meta a step further back, looking more closely at us, the player, and how we are directly manipulating this singular character within the game, and how we force them to then control others. Chris takes on this Spamton Neo fight alone, and is observably shaken after. It's something they didn't want to take part in, were forced to listen to a lot of harsh truths, and then when asked about it after the fact, struggled to even share their own opinion fighting against our control. So while it's simple to guess that these secret bosses are going to carry on the same themes that have been present in the previous two chapters, something that takes a little bit more of a shot in the dark approach is what form this third secret boss will end up taking. Our current secret bosses are characters that once held a position of relatively high rank next to that chapter's main boss. Jevil was a court jester for the king, and Spamton is known to have been in favor with the queen. I don't have a strong idea of how this secret boss could be a fallen, discarded character, or how they're connected to Mike. It's all assuming a lot, but I think those are two relatively predictable character traits. So what sort of unwanted or discarded things do we have lying about? What I think is probably the most exciting prospect is Toriel's garbage that's currently filled with Asgore's disposed flowers. This is something set up from one of the earliest parts of the game, which is so cool. We may end up with some sort of flower-like boss, one that feeds off hate and rejects any value to be found in love, taught by Toriel, a character who encourages isolation and rejects friendship. I expect that to be very crucial for Susie's development, with her likely being the one to stand up to this character, having recently discovered the value of having friends and those close to you to care about. We even saw the TV with a sinister grin in those final moments, which felt most closely connected to Photoshop Flowey. It wasn't literal, but very little of what's been seen in Deltarune is a one-to-one recreation of what came before with Undertale. Seemingly is kind of the point. So our new interpretation of this will instead be a collection of dying, wilting flowers, playing up the horror side of things even more than Omega Flowey. Depending how far the fountain reaches, we may end up tying in Asriel's room, and thus some of his personality, creating a twisted alternate form Flowey, one that is separate from and unlike what we saw in Undertale. If that is the case, I fully expect to fight this boss alongside Toriel, as that would just be too damn interesting to force her to fight against something that represents both her son and her broken marriage. So that gives us a pretty broad picture of the different areas we're going to move through, the themes surrounding it, potentially the types of enemies and bosses we'll encounter, secrets along the way, the characters that'll be included, potentially a few specific and major plot points that might play out through that. Yeah, I think we're getting a pretty good picture of what Chapter 3 may be. With all this talk about control and freedom, something that I definitely need to address is how I think different routes are going to play out through the remaining chapters. We've got to talk about our potential follow-up to the weird route. Chapter 1 lacked any sort of alternate routes, which made sense with its insistence that choices did not matter. And now with the weird route in Chapter 2, that's actually what it's called in the game files, I really liked Snowgrave route, just sounds cooler, but I think it's unlikely to be directly followed up. The weird route instead implies its larger possibilities. Through that segment of the alternate route, we corrupt Noelle, forcing her to behave violently and act out of character. The end result is basically a genocide route, killing many NPCs and skipping large portions of the game. When this route is completed, Noelle wakes up with a newfound confidence and desire to take charge of her own life, while Birdly, who was killed in the Dark World, doesn't wake up at all, seemingly trapped in a limbo. What happens down in this Dark World affects the real world, going so far as to affect characters' personalities. We can't have a subset of players picking up a game with a fallen Birdly and not have that be addressed. I don't think there's going to be 1,000 different branches off of this with entirely new versions of the route to be played. I think it'll probably come down to when you choose to abandon the weird route. Do you do it only in Chapter 2? Do you carry it on through 2 and 3 and then abandon it? Maybe it'll be possible to skip it in Chapter 2, but then pick it up in Chapter 3? There's a lot of potential there. I don't know how deep and varied those possibilities will be, but I think it's unlikely to have a bunch of different branches that then need to separately pay off. It'll instead be what percentage of the weird route did you complete. I think it's less likely that Noelle and Birdly will be present in this chapter at all. So the fact that Noelle is changed and Birdly is unconscious won't directly affect most of what we see. It may just become a plot point after closing the fountain. The setup we've seen here begins at nighttime and at a location where those two are almost guaranteed not to stumble upon it. Instead, we are likely to corrupt and influence a different character, and depending who or how we manipulate and change them, we'll then see plot points play out, like how they interact with a changed or unchanged Noelle. So yes, Snowgrave is a cool way to refer to this portion of the weird route, but it's feeling a lot more clear to me why it was given a semi-generic name. Anyways, I'm predicting that Chapter 3's weird route will instead include Chris and Toriel together. We have our obvious themes of control in the first 2 chapters. Chapter 3 could be about Toriel giving up some control of Chris and trusting them to manage their own life, something Toriel's never been good at before. Both the boss and secret boss could teach Toriel this lesson in a regular route. She'll see Chris Chris kicking ass, taking charge, and feel comfortable backing off more than she maybe ever has. This chapter could largely be about Toriel coming to terms with Chris's independence and seeing that they can easily look out for themselves. But as a mother, Toriel has been blinded to this darkness within Chris, or the darkness that is seemingly us, the player, influencing Chris, and this chapter will have her forcibly confront that. I could see this playing out two ways. If Toriel thinks she's dreamering, knowing that she fell asleep on the chariot, she may actually agree to use her fire powers to kill enemies, not understanding or considering the consequences, and just glad to spend time with Chris. Or with one of the defining qualities of Toriel's personality being her overprotective nature, I think our manipulations will play out differently. We directly told Noelle what to do, being insistent and pushing her in those directions. I don't think Toriel would respond well to Chris suddenly bossing her around. Instead, I think this will play out by us putting Chris in harm's way and forcing them to take a dive in fights, allowing Chris to be hurt and even faint. Then, when pushed in this way, given the right context, Toriel could lash out, driven to protect her cub. I think this is more likely, and it'll help things feel more distinct. It'll keep it unpredictable and engaging for us as a player. I haven't watched it yet, as I didn't want it to influence my own theory crafting, but I suspect this is the topic of Swankybox's video, and that he came to pretty well the same conclusion. Maybe Toriel will be made to kill Undyne the way Noelle kills Birdley. That sounds pretty hardcore. Not necessarily the direction I see it going, but yeah, there's some potential there. I also imagine that's gonna mess with people's minds, because I get semi-frequent comments that me and Swanky sound the same. We even had a brief conversation about it on Twitter. I'm not sure either of us hear it so much. We both must just sound like generic white young adult men. What can I tell you? We probably all sound the same. And a ridiculous tangent here. I'm so interested to see what the hell the chariot becomes in this world. There's no way that isn't tied in. There is still a chance that this weird route acts as a Noelle-only thing. But I think it would be far more interesting if, in addition to directly controlling Chris through Deltarune, we are given this option to take it even further and directly influence and change the personalities of those closest to Chris. We control Chris, and by proxy begin to control their entire world. That's so dark and fascinating. And if this whole thing does end up being some sort of simulation being run by Dr. Gaster, as seems to be the case, I'm putting like a bit of stock in that, it's not a confirmed thing. You can watch my Pieces of Gaster videos to see how that layers together. Then oh man, the final moments where we're confronted with our choices of being so sinister is gonna be heavy. And with that, this is everything I have to share specifically on the likely direction of Chapter 3. It's so cool that Toby gave us 2 free chapters. As with only 1 chapter, I don't think we'd be able to really see the direction all this was heading. But now with 2 examples of the Dark Worlds, their paths, how choices factor in, their general structure, and the supposed rules and appearances of the fountains, we are given so much more to work with. It actually kind of makes me wish that the remaining chapters were also released one at a time. Maybe if that was closer together, something like a 6-month gap, it would just be so fun for the community to work together, spending years slowly piecing this together, making more predictions like these as we're handed bit by bit to read into. I actually wrote out predictions for the remaining fountains, where they will appear, how this will play out across the 7 teased chapters, what characters will be pulled in and explored through this, with less emphasis on the themes or specific guesses like upcoming boss battles, since we don't actually have specific teases for those yet. Presumably not. Who knows how deeply this stuff is stitched into this game. As I was writing it all out, it just was quickly spinning into a massive video, and since one is so specific and the second is so broad, it made a lot of sense to split it up. I know so many people would have subscribed in the heyday of my Deltarune videos in, that September or October range after Chapter 2 dropped. This isn't and never has been a Deltarune only channel. It's just a series I really enjoy digging into, but hopefully this is evidence that it's not going away as a topic of conversation. I'll space them out, maybe once every month or 2. We'll have the second prediction video coming up. I have more theory ideas in mind. I want to carry on doing the gigs for Undertale, as I want to really comprehensively document that game as well, ideally before the next next chapters of Deltarune drop, and other fun video ideas surrounding the series. And in the meantime, I recommend you hop into the Two Left Thumbs Discord and join in on some of the awesome theory crafting and discussions we have on the series there. This weekend is actually Canadian Thanksgiving, so I'll be off hanging out with some family, and I feel like I have a lot to be thankful for this year, and a lot of that stems from all of you. So genuinely, from deep down in my heart, thank you all for watching and sticking with things all these years. I know I have no consistency in the topics I cover, so it means a lot that you would stick around. I would be especially thankful if you went and followed along with the They Speak from the Abyss Kickstarter or added it to your Steam wishlist. I gotta plug that one more time. I look forward to hearing everyone's comments down below. This should be a really interesting starting point for some amazing discussions, and I hope that in a few years' time I can come back to this video, hold it up against the actual chapter, and see if I got anything right. Maybe I'll even be able to reference your comments at that time to see if anyone there predicted anything. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you to patrons of the channel for their continued support. I'm very happy with how things are going over there. I think I'm making it a more viable thing and more worth contributing to. And I hope to see you all again soon.